Welcome everyone, once again we are here right in the middle of our nuclear holocaust. It's tough to survive over here, but I guess I will deal with the radiation damage later in my old age. But for now, we can do what we did also yesterday for the raid, the recap of the second week of Season 2, and we can do it for Mythic Plus as well. In this second week of Season 2, we also got the fortified week, the first fortified week of the season as well. So we're going to be doing the same thing we did for the raid, which is going back in time to check and compare how Mythic Plus was, how the meta and the popularity of the specs was in the second to third week of Season 1, and then compare it to this second week of Season 2 to see just how wildly the meta and the popularity of the specs have changed, and compare it to today, as well as taking a look at the current rankings and tier lists of the different roles in Mythic Plus and the difficulty, the chance of completion of the keys at the moment, the most popular compositions in Mythic Plus, etc, etc. So we can start very quickly, once again, cutting to the chase with the popularity of the tanks. Compared to the start of Season 1, this is the situation. So, at the start of Season 1, of course, Prot Warrior was the #1 tank, supposed to be the OP one, and now at the start of Season 2 is Prot Paladin. Prot Paladin is even more popular than what Protection Warrior was at the start of Season 1. You can see, I find it pretty funny, but at the same time pretty sad, the loss of quite a few of the Hopium enjoyers at the start of Season 1. You can see how at the start of the season and at the start of the expansion, when things were much more of a question mark, things were much more in the dark, there were many players being hopeful about Guardian Druid, many players being hopeful about Vengeance, even many players being hopeful about Prot Paladin, when it wasn't really strong. So compared to the start of this season, you see way fewer of the Guardian Druid enjoyers and way fewer of the Vengeance Demon Hunter enjoyers compared to the start of Season 1. And of course, way fewer of the Protection Warrior enjoyers as well. So this has been the main difference at the start of the season when it comes to tanks at all key levels. Okay, everyone joining Mythic Plus has gotten these results between the start of Season 1 and the start of Season 2. Then you can see it also from the healer angle. The main difference of the healer angle is that at the start of Season 1, a lot of power was put in Resto Druid and Preservation Evoker, and now things are a bit more balanced. Priests are more balanced than the start of Season 1. You also have Druid and Preservation Evoker now joined by Resto Shaman at the start of Season 2. That's the main difference from what we saw in the first couple of weeks of Season 1, in the first couple of weeks of the start of this expansion. We then, of course, have the biggest of the differences, which is the one for the melee DPS, obviously because of the rework of Retribution Paladin. We have mentioned this. Based on our historical data, this is the most popular a melee DPS spec has ever been. I think the previous record was something like 19% of all of the player base, which was for, I believe, Outlaw Rogue. Now it's 24%, it's over 24% by Ret Paladin players. That's the main biggest difference. We also see that at the start of this season we have fewer warriors, we also have fewer rogues, we also have fewer Windwalker monks and fewer Havoc Demon Hunters. Why? Well, because they went to play Red Paladin. That's why. The last of the roles, the range DPS from the start of Season 1 to the start of Season 2, saw the growth, doubled increase, 100% increase of Shadow Priest, of course, after their rework and several buffs. We also see, still not a surprise, the popularity of Hunters as well as Warlocks being much more even now compared to the start of Season 1. Not too much, not too visible of a difference for specs like Elemental, specs like Balance Druid, and even the Mage specs, which just got Frost Mage to be more popular than the other two specs in Mythic Plus. Then when we can start to see, the more meaningful changes is of course in the big boy keys, the keys at 20 plus and higher. That's when you can start to see the meta being shaped. That's when you can start to see people in the looking for group tool typing shaman heal or prot pal and evoker in their looking for group tool, because that's what they think is best and what they want to bring in their keys. So the difference for tanks is almost a mirror, but with different colors for the most popular one, because the 44% of all prot warriors in the second week of season 1 becomes 47% of prot paladins in the second week of season 2. Once again, you have DK, which seems like he is glitching every season. Doesn't matter who is the best tank, who is the worst tank. Seems like DK is always just second, is always just chilling there as a solid backup. That seems to be the state right now of Blood Death Knight. There is, as far as the other tanks changing from the start of season 1, there is a much bigger presence of Brewmaster Monk. As you can see here, more than double the amount of monks now in keys compared to the start of season 1. That is definitely, once you stop being mesmerized by the growth of the pink and the fall of the brown, the green is the one that grew the most at the start of season 2. Now, when it comes to healers, once again, we still have much more of a balance. This was kind of brutal at the start of season 1. As you can see here, we have a whooping 62% of all healers being just from 2 specs, Druid and Evoker. Now, the 60-ish% is made up by the Shaman, plus the Druid, plus the Evoker. So we still have a 60% presence, but now it's 3 specs instead of 2. So, baby steps. Things are getting more balanced, things are getting more even. We also got a massive growth of discipline, because even while Resto Shaman goes from 5% to 25%, grows by like 5 times as much, discipline goes from 2.5 to 11. So that's also a very big growth in season 2. So now we have every single healer but Mistweaver above 10% representation. I put the benchmark, right, the hallmark of being a decent spec at 10%. So if you are above 10% in play rate when it comes to healers who only have 7 specs and tanks who only have 6 specs, if you are above 10%, you are doing at the very least fine. So for healers in season 1, you only had 4 specs above 10% in high keys. Now you have 6 specs above 10%. So definite improvement when it comes to healers in high keys. Now, is there an improvement when it comes to the melee DPS? Spoiler, no. When it comes to the melee DPS, things, if anything, have gotten worse. Because at the start of season 1, we had Fury, Outlaw, Windwalker and Havoc being the most popular spec and the most used choices in Mythic Plus. And then Enhancement, almost making it, almost getting to 10% in the high keys of Mythic Plus. Now, at the start of Season 2, you still have Fury, you still have Subtlety, and you still have Havoc, and you have basically replaced Windwalker with Red Paladin. Except now Red Paladin is even more popular than the best of Season 1 at 21%, and now Red is at 24%. So it's not that things have gotten better, it's not that things have gotten more even, more balanced, more spread. The wealth has been shared across multiple specs. For the melee, not really. There has just been a change in management. We went from yellow to pink, basically, at the start of Season 2. Not really much else changing for the melee DPS. Now, for the ranged DPS, I would say things are slightly better, because at the start of Season 1, there was a massive gap between the top 2 and the rest. As you can see here, that number right there for the ranged is for Marksmanship Hunter. Now it's much more even between the two, and overall it's much lower down. The top goes from 22% of Season 1 to just 11% of Season 2. So basically it's gotten cut in half. Shadow Priest, of course, grew much more than before. You have much more even and balanced state between mages. Back at the start of Season 1, it was mostly Arcane Mage, whereas now we flipped over to Frost Mage, although not nearly as dominant as Arcane was in the first weeks of Season 1. Also, at the start of Season 1, look at that gigantic pile for Warlock. That was Demo, now it's Destruction, and still Demo is doing fine. Balance Druid is actually unchanged, despite being one of the specs which received the most amount of changes from Season 1 to Season 2. They are still just sitting around 10%, and a slight growth goes for Devastation Evoker as well. So I would say that overall, from Season 1 in the first couple of weeks to this season, things are more even. In Season 1, you can basically identify 4 specs in there doing fine. Now you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 even specs being fine in Mythic Plus. So it's a definite improvement, at the very least in terms of choices compared to last season. Now, these are the tier lists made by Subcreation based on the amount of keys being run by each spec, plus the level of the keys being run by each spec. So no surprise here, you can see Protection Paladin being a C ahead, a desert ahead of the other tanks, with Prot Warrior being at the bottom. This is not too surprising when it comes to tanks. When it comes to healers, it's much more even and muddy. Yes, Shaman is ahead, but not that much. And then you have a nice and healthy share of the rest of the population for healers between Discipline, Resto Druid and Preservation Evoker, which is better than the dominance of Evoker and Druid we had in Season 1. Same goes for the melee DPS, it's an orgy. Funnily enough, despite Red Paladin being the absolutely most popular, that doesn't make it the absolutely most powerful. It's still Subtlety, the spec that overall is being put in the most keys and in the highest of keys, more importantly, compared to Red Paladin. Many still of the specs doing well in Season 1 are still here being quite high, like Fury, Havoc, Enhancement and Windwalker, still performing quite nicely. For the range DPS, we do have an interesting change, as usual, this weird situation with Fire. Fire not necessarily being one of the most popular specs in Mythic Plus, but always ending up quite high as a rating, as a spec chosen for very high keys over the other mage options. So we still see Shadow Priest being at the top like they were by the end of Season 1. Other specs that were high-ish at the end of Season 1, like Devastation and Balance Druid, doing fine. It's just with this special thing of Fire currently showing up very well in performance, not nearly as much in popularity, but still in performance doing quite well. Now, what we can also see, which was much harder to see last week, because of course last week we didn't even have Fortified in Mythic Plus, so we only had Tyrannical, is how difficult dungeons have been, how tough they have been. For example, this one up to now is for Fortified for this week. It's interesting to see that we do have what seems to be quite the outlier of Neltharus in Fortified being much harder than the other dungeons. We also live in an interesting bizarro world where Freehold, usually considered a very easy and accessible dungeon in BFA for Mythic Plus, is currently the second hardest dungeon when it comes to Fortified. There are quite a few mobs becoming quite dangerous in Fortified weeks, especially bolstering Fortified weeks in Freehold, which have made the dungeon quite tough, perhaps maybe even baiting people by how easy Freehold was in Tyrannical, you know, jumping in Freehold, thinking to get an easy and comfy key, and then they discover that Fortified mobs in there actually hurt. What is no surprise though is Underrot. Underrot definitely doesn't have nearly as many tough and dangerous trash mobs compared to Freehold, so still the very easy and accessible dungeon for now. It's also good to see and to check the overall ease of dungeons, not just compared to last week's Tyrannical, but also compared to Season 1. Now, the answer is no, there is still no dungeon that is beating Shadowmoon Burial Grounds. Yeah, what a surprise. SBG is still at the top of the absolutely most easy dungeons. However, funnily enough, Neltharus is already setting itself up to be the worst of the dungeons in terms of ease of completion, beating the Azurvold in terms of difficulty. We do have also, not really a surprise, Freehold, the tyrannical version of Freehold, making its way in the top 3 of most easy weeks in terms of dungeons, as well as Uldaman. This might be surprising. Tyrannical Uldaman being considered easier than Tyrannical Court of Stars. I don't think that rings quite true. I would definitely have more trouble and more fear of some of the Uldaman bosses on Tyrannical than on Court of Stars bosses on Tyrannical. That being said, to be fair, Season 1 dungeons also have weeks upon weeks of nerfs, of hotfixes and changes to make the dungeons easier. So in time, in the next weeks maybe, with more nerfs coming through to Season 2 dungeons, they might become progressively easier to complete. So the rating, the difficulty rating of the dungeons of Season 2 is definitely bound to go down a bit over time. Then, for last, something quite dear to me, checking the most popular compositions in Mythic Plus. So, how likely are you to see this particular comp in your Mythic Plus groups when it comes to the tanks, popularity, healers, and then damage dealers? Now, in the top 24 of the most popular comps, what a surprise, the number 1 tank and the only visible tank in there is Prot Paladin. That's it. That is not a surprise, we can just move on, we know this already. When it comes to healers, it's unsurprisingly Resto Shaman being the number 1 choice for the majority of the groups, and then slightly lower down you start seeing more presence of Resto Druid and then of Preservation Evoker. That is also more or less what we have noticed from looking at the popularity of the healers. What's more interesting, however, is to look at the DPS, because for the DPS we are going to be merging the ranged with the melee. So, we're going to make a DPS salad and see who gets on top in the end. This is what I meant when I mentioned the very popular Red Paladin, but not nearly as popular in the higher keys, because if you look at this, Red Paladin is only present in 4 out of the 12 top groups. It's still less popular, half as popular as Subrogue, for example. It's also a third of the popularity of Shadow Priest. It's also just as popular as Havoc, Demon Hunter, and slightly more popular than Balanced Druid. Interestingly, looking at the other popular or somewhat popular specs from Mythic Plus that we just looked at, there is no Windwalker Monk in here, there is no Hunter in here, and there is no Devastation Evoker in here. We also have just 1 Enhancement Shaman, just 2 Warlocks, and just 1 Frost Mage. So that's as far as it goes for the most popular and the more represented compositions of the party in your Mythic Plus keys. So this is the situation at the moment in the second week of Mythic Plus for Season 2 when it comes to the popularity of the specs, especially compare them to the popularity of the second week of the start of Season 1. Then we also have the difficulty of the dungeons in this fortified week, as well as the difficulty of the dungeons overall across both of the seasons, and lastly, we can see the most popular of the compositions in Mythic Plus for all of the specs. So, with this out of the way, we are now done with our recap of Season 2 and the second week of Mythic Plus. We will of course continue to monitor how the situation progresses in Mythic Plus, whether or not Blizzard gives out more nerfs to the dungeons, maybe some balance tuning to the specs. We will see that later on in the season. But for now, on this Monday and the start of this new week, this is where we are leaving each other, guys. So, for today, we are thanking, as usual, all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution to the growth of the channel. You can, of course, as usual, still support completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. You can then also support in other free ways, like following me over on my Twitter, as well as following me over on my stream on Twitch. So with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I will repeat my hunch from yesterday. I still believe by the end of the next reset we are going to get some more hotfix balance tuning to some of the specs.